I'll turn to Jeff now.
Thanks a lot. If I could have the PowerPoint, actually. First, I think that Marcelo earns at least a doctorate honoris causa in economics. That was brilliant.
It could be you, eh?
No, really brilliant introduction. And I want to thank Marcelo, of course, for this partnership, and thank everybody for being here. We have Ethics in Action group and a number of guest experts around the table. We'll have a very, very interesting and important discussion. And we do face the challenge that the corruption is pervasive and it's in front of our eyes, but we have not been able to find ways to get it under control. And if anything, it's becoming less and less controlled in recent years. So this is, I think, a stunning fact and a puzzle for us. Partly it's a matter of diagnosis and partly it's a matter of prescription. And the challenge for us is to be clever and creative in the next 2 days to see how we can somehow help to move forward an agenda and a process to reverse this wave of massive corruption in many, many of the important countries. Now, this is not connected or working, or should I point it someplace? Now, to move forward, it's just not clicking forward. Not the pointer, but the moving it.
Yes.
There we go. Okay. No? Oh, it just isn't going to work? Okay. So, our theme is the marriage of Laudato Si, the great religious traditions, and sustainable development, and notably the Sustainable Development Goals as our agreed but still very fragile global framework for addressing the challenges that we've been discussing. And it's notable that the Sustainable Development Goals take up this challenge, and I want to start with noting that because this is our leverage inside the diplomatic world. Sustainable Development Goal 16 calls for the promotion of peaceful and inclusive societies, to provide access to justice for all, and to build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions. And some of the notable targets are 16.3 to promote the rule of law, 16.4 to significantly reduce illicit financial and arms flows, 16.5 to substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms, 16.6 to develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions, and 16.7 to ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making. I think it's important to see this as a package because these are mutually reinforcing targets. They each offer in part some solutions or approaches to help achieve the other respective targets. Participation, inclusion, representative decision-making, responsiveness is one of the most important vehicles for reducing corruption. Strengthening the rule of law per se is an important aspect. Go to the next. So this is a question that's been with us for a long time. at least since the Roman Empire. Who will guard the guardians? This is the paradox of power, which is we need government. The libertarian fantasy that one can do, or the anarchic fantasy that one can do without government, is a fantasy. It's a fantasy in part motivated by the corruption of government and the corruption of power. On the other hand, it's a fantasy, so we are stuck with the fundamental dilemma that we need a state that mobilizes power, but then doesn't abuse power. And this question of how to have a state that is both powerful, limited, and responsible is at the core of this question of corruption. We can't do away with government because we need government to express the common good. On the other hand, as soon as there is government, and as Weber put it sociologically, the monopoly of legitimate violence, then there is the potential of using that violence for corrupt and narrow purposes. Of course, as Marcelo just said, Aristotle got there first in all of it, so he noted 2,300 years ago in the Politics how state institutions can be for the common good and how they can be for the particular bad, and did it in his quintessential way with a deep categorization, an application of the constitutions of Greece, of the city-states, and with tremendous perspicacity. Next. There is also, I think, for our time, an extremely important statement by Lord Acton, a very famous statement: power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And this is extremely important because this is really a statement of mechanism, and it's a very sharp and smart statement of mechanism. Great men are almost always bad men, even when they exercise influence and not authority, still more when you superadd the tendency or the certainty of corruption by authority. There is no worse heresy than that the office sanctifies the holder of it. That is the point at which the negation of Catholicism and the negation of liberalism meet and keep high festival, and the end learns to justify the means. I did not know until getting this quotation this morning that actually this was a reaction to the doctrine of papal infallibility. So Lord Acton was a leading Catholic of England, and he was an opponent of the modern statement of papal infallibility, and applied it in this context, which I think is good for us to contemplate. Next. Another favorite author of mine is Pyotr Sorokin, who was the founder of the sociology department at Harvard University in the 1920s. Sorokin was a Russian emigre who studied power and morality. One of Sorokin's specialties was to count the murder rates of those in power over the past millennium. And he made several generalizations that I think are important for us. I'll just read, I'll start with number 3. He says, the moral behavior of ruling groups tends to be the more criminal and submoral than that of the ruled strata of the same society. Number 4, the greater, more absolute and coercive the powers of the rulers, political leaders, and big executives of business, labor, and other organizations, and the less freely this power is approved by the ruled population, the more corrupt and criminal such ruling groups and executives tend to be. And 5th, with the progressive limitation of their power, criminality of rulers and executives tends to decrease qualitatively by becoming less grave and murderous, and quantitatively by decreasing the rate of criminal actions. He showed that in the monarchies of Europe, the murder rates were roughly 40 per 100, many orders of magnitude higher. All the kings were murderers, basically. They killed their brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, children, neighbors, priests.
Especially in England.
Exactly, especially in England. But he also has a wonderful section where he talks about a gathering of U.S. executives in the 1920s and then tracks what happened to them over the next 15 years. Many of them went to prison. Others fled the country to escape from imprisonment. A few went mad and ended up in asylums. And they were the leaders of business of the 1920s in the U.S. So his was an empirical approach to this subject. Next. And then I will quote Dostoevsky, who was also a very powerful identifier of human psychology. When a man has unlimited power over the flesh and blood of his fellow men, when a man is in a position to degrade another human being to the limit of degradation, he is unable to resist the temptation to do wrong. Tyranny is a habit. In the end, it becomes a disease. The best man in the world becomes so brutalized as to be indistinguishable from a wild beast. So these are all on the theme that that power corrupts. And this, I think, is very important for us. It is a process, and it is related to the very act of holding power. There are, of course, a number of attempts to understand the psychology of this, the neurobiological pathways, and the mechanisms by which power corrupts. One is testosterone, which is that status and victory actually gives the impulse of more attempt to control and degrade others by proving one's status. A second phenomenon to mention, because the United States has it in its president right now, is psychopathy, which is a clinical condition, a kind of antisocial personality disorder, usually attributed to the nature of upbringing, which seems pretty clear in Trump's case, with a hostile father who taught the lack of love and instilled a kind of desperate lack of self-worth in our president. And psychopathy means a biological incapacity to feel the emotions of others and a will to dominate others and a loss of control over rule abiding. So Trump does not believe in rules. This is clear. This is not something to convince him. This is a neuropathy. He's diseased, and all evidence of psychopathy is that it is incurable in an adult. So he's to be controlled, not to be convinced. He's not to be shamed. He's not to be reasoned to. He is a dangerous man, impulsive and unable to feel and control his own emotions. And when the first rule of power is that psychopaths should not come anywhere close to power. This is a absolute prima facie failure of American the political system to allow a person like this to power. Other aspects of the psychology of corruption are within group loyalty, because a lot of corruption is actually corruption of organizations rather than corruption of individuals. So it is families, clans, tribes, or corporations that are corrupt. You're part of the system. And we know that within group loyalty is one of the most powerful psychological mechanisms of human beings, one of our greatest weaknesses. It is stunning, and it is one of Jesus's greatest wisdoms to say, why do you note the mote in the other person's eye when you don't note the beam in your own eye? This is core to human nature, but it's amplified by the group. The other is always wrong. Today there's an editorial by in the Washington Post about all the sins of all the other countries except the United States, and therefore why it's right for Trump to be punishing Erdogan and punishing this and punishing China without one moment reflecting on what the U.S. is doing in the world. So this is a psychological incapacity that we all share. A fourth aspect of psychology is permission. The rich and the powerful are often given permission, which is a stunning fact. Who is the leader of the presidential race in Brazil today? It's Lula, behind bars, in prison, convicted of corruption. Doesn't matter. He would win probably in a landslide. So this is also a derangement of society, that people that are corrupt are often empowered and encouraged. Adam Smith wrote about this brilliantly in The Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759, when he talked about how the rich and the powerful have the adulation of the public even when they behave miserably. So it's a psychological phenomenon that we are somehow primed to even adulate those who are stealing blind from us. Of course, there are all manners of rationalization, and there is a culture of impunity that is a possible explanation, which is that when crime pays and when it is pervasive, it becomes the habit. And I think that habit formation is another very, very important dimension of this. Argentina has the habit of corruption for a long time. The United States has the habit of corruption for a very, very long time. So, as Sorokin also emphasized, part of the problem is who we select to be leaders, and then the second is the occupational effect. Once you're there, even a decent person or a decent group can become deeply corrupted by the process of holding power. Yeah, next. This begs for institutional responses, especially if it's the case that the mere holding of power is corrupting itself. It means that the control of corruption requires institutional answers, and this is part of our goal and our discussion. Next. So first, who are the potential agents of corruption? They are the holders of power. And we're going to focus on politics, but we should think of politicians, political parties, police, judges, public administrators, religious leaders, corporations, educators. These are all groups that have power in society. And we can find corruption in every one of these organizations. And the challenges are manifest across all of these organizations and require specific organizational responses. Next. Also, in our world, we have tremendous global abuses of power, abuses of the powerful, by the powerful of the weak. So we have transnational systems of corruption that are extremely powerful. And we have the questions of, actually, I think, could you go back just one? Yes, starting here. What are some of the institutional ways to limit executive power? Of course, in principle, legal codes are the starting point, that there is rule of law. So that the holders of power have to abide by transparent, known, publicly identified rules. This is extremely weak, however. In the U.S. Constitution, there are many clauses that are very relevant and grotesquely ignored every day. The U.S. Constitution grants Congress the right the sole right to declare war, for example, but almost all American wars are led by the executive without any declaration of war by